Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing very well and keeping yourself lovely and warm during the winter. And go and get that lovely hot drink, because I've got a lovely story for you tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. How many? I asked excitedly. Oh, there's 6 puppies. I'm looking at them right now. They're so adorable. Wilhelmina looks as proud as Punch. Oh, there's one more. It's coming out right now. I see the sack. She's tearing it open, eating it up. She's licking the puppy clean with her tongue. Oh, they're so cute. They're wiggling around, looking for Wilhelmina's teats. So there's 7 puppies. That's incredible. What colour are they? They're creamy, just like Wilhelmina. That means that Mrs. Phillips' golden retriever must be the father. She never got him neutered, you know. So they're all golden retriever puppies. That's amazing. An unlikely accident. That's what I'm thinking. Oh, please can't you come over now to see them? I really want you to. They're so beautiful. I glanced at the clock. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm in my bedroom doing my homework. I promised I'd work until 6 o'clock. Can't you creep out of the window, Julia? Your mother will never know. You can pop over for 15 minutes. She'll never know you're missing. Please come now. All right, I'll see you in a tick, but I can't be long or my mother will kill me. I knew I shouldn't be sneaking out of our ranch-style farmhouse at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but I was eager to see Wilhelmina's puppies. I knew if I was very quick about it, my parents would be none the wiser. I squeezed out of my bedroom window and dashed towards the shed where I retrieved my bicycle. In seconds I was cycling down the country road towards my best friend's farmhouse. I had no regrets seeing Wilhelmina and her 7 beautiful puppies, as it had been so exciting, as the golden retriever looked as proud as Punch about her 7 little younglings, and I was in total awe of these beautiful puppies, so much so that I'd completely lost track of time. I could see that the sun was setting. Before long, the dark shadows of early twilight would infuse the sky with an inky blackness, so I needed to make tracks home as quickly as possible. I didn't fancy riding home in the dark. If my parents found out I was missing from my bedroom and was guilty of failing to do my homework, they would not be best pleased with me. I could find myself being grounded for a week or more. I climbed onto my bicycle, cycling hurriedly down the road, pedalling as fast as I possibly could, as tormenting, inauspicious pictures of my mother's peaked face whirled around in my head, ominous visions of her reprimanding me. My mother could be as tough as old boots when she got mad about something. The last thing I wanted was to be on the receiving end of her wrath. My father could be very forgiving, but my mother was like a dog with a bone when her feathers got ruffled. You could rest assured that if you did something wrong, you would constantly be reminded of your iniquity for weeks to come. I was ever grateful that there were street lights on the asphalt road, so at least I could see more clearly. It had grown dark, as if someone had turned the dimmer switch to low. It seemed like only moments before the tangerine-orange sunset had dappled everything in a golden glaze. But now things had become menacing, foreboding. I could see the baleful, shadowy silhouettes of the red maple and red budwood trees on either side of the embankment, swaggering minaciously in the breeze. Even these gentle giants had taken on a sinister, portentous pose. I felt as if I was being watched by pernicious eyes that drilled through my back like jagged knives. I felt instinctively that something was very wrong, as even the crickets and frogs had not started to sing yet. My gaze was fixated on the trees. I could swear I could see foreboding, airy shadows creeping in the looming darkness, and hear sinister whispers calling my name provocatively in the wind. Julia, Julia, Julia. Was I imagining this, I wondered? My parents, like many West Virginian elders, did not like us being out in the darkness, as stories abounded of myths, fables, legends, and bizarre accounts of peculiar beings that haunted the woods at the dead of night. But up until now, I had never given those thoughts a moment's credence. I thought the stories were made up by well-meaning adults who wanted to be certain that their children would not go exploring the woods at night. In a trice I saw something obscure but tall and dark standing in the middle of the road. But as I neared my approach, I saw it clearly. It was a direful-looking creature, easily over 6 foot tall. It looked like a human, covered in thick, short, cropped hair, but with a dog-like muzzle and full feathered tail, while the hands on this thing had acute, razor-sharp talons that were so serrated they could tear you limb from limb, easily searing flesh as seamlessly as a butcher's roast. In that moment the adrenaline coursed through my veins as the creature glared at me through these antagonistic, malevolent, baleful red eyes. It growled at me so fiercely that I nearly fell off my bike. I thought I was staring into the eyes of the devil himself, or one of his helpers that stokes up the flames of hell. For a second I wondered if I was actually seeing a demon. I knew I had to get away as fast as I possibly could, because this thing, whatever in God's name it was, wanted my blood. Of that I was in no doubt, for the eldritch look it gave me was a threatening kind of hungry, predatory look that was just so horrifying. My heart was thumping so violently. I was losing my balance on my bike as the fear that coursed through my veins undermined my good judgment. I quickly turned around in the middle of the road to ride back towards my friend's house. I couldn't ride past this gruesome creature. There was no way I could. But I could hear it running after me. It grabbed my bike, began to shake it hard. While I began to scream, my breathing quickened, my fear escalated, seizing my entire body with a terror that heightened my ability to ride my bicycle even faster. But the creature was holding my bike down so hard that I was pedalling away as if I was on a stationary bike. Then I heard the unwelcome purr of an engine, but the truck never stopped. I remember going, "No! Please, no!" After that my memory goes blank. But I was to learn from Mrs. Rolfe, who was driving down the road at the time of the collision, that she was tapping a message in her cell phone to her husband Lucas. "I'm on my way now. I'll be home in 10 minutes. For a moment her attention was diverted off the road. A moment was all it took. That's all it ever takes. A second of distraction. Then your life can be changed forever. She then heard the awful screeching sound. She realised she'd run over something in the road. Something very substantial. She'd heard the metal of a bike being gnarled, folded, buckled and pulverised by her own vehicle. Mrs. Ralph's pulse began to race at 100 miles an hour as she slammed down her brake as hard as she could with her foot. She climbed hurriedly out of her truck. Her heart was filled with trepidation and terror as she inspected the dreadful carnage. She gasped in horror. She found my body lying in a crumpled heap in the middle of the road, my eyes staring vacantly into space like a dead fish, my body as floppy and unflinching as a rag doll, my skin the colour of death, my disfigured bicycle a mangled wreck. She let out a terrified scream. "Oh, my God! Please, no! This can't be happening!" She ran towards me, shaking my body as vigorously as she could, hoping against all hope that she could wake me out of my enforced slumber. But my body just flopped lifelessly. My legs and arms dangled, drooping in strange angles. Mrs. Rolfe was gripped by feelings of overwhelming dread, while a shameful guilt stabbed at her gut. "I should have been watching the road," she told herself angrily. "I'm a bloody idiot. Look what I've done. Tonight I've destroyed lives, starting with my very own. I can live with what I've done to myself, but not what I've done to an innocent family. I can never forgive myself for this," she thought. Julia, it's me. It's Mrs. Ralph. Are you all right, Julia?" Blood was pouring out of my mouth. My eyes rolled in the back of my head. She checked for a pulse. She could hear a low murmur. Frantically, Mrs. Rolfe grabbed her phone, calling the ambulance. "Come at once. I've run over a girl in the middle of the road. The girl's name is Julia Clarkson. Yes, I can feel a pulse, but I'm scared. I think she's fading. She might die." "Calm down, madam. We're on our way. Please stay with the young girl." Mrs. Ralph had to be sedated when the ambulance arrived, as she had become a bag of nerves. "It's all my fault," she was crying. "I should have been paying attention to the road. Look what I've done! I was placed on a gurney and taken to the hospital by ambulance, but I remember nothing of that journey. Robert's account. It must have been about 5:45 when we could hear ambulance sirens in the distance. Even my mother wondered if someone had been in an accident. Oh dear, she reflected. Whoever they are, I do hope they're all right, and I hope it's not someone we know. 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang to our home. It was unusual to have guests visiting our home this late in the evening, so I went to see who it was. My mother had answered the door. She was talking to a police officer. The blue warning lights on his vehicle were flashing in our driveway, alerting me to the fact that this was not a social visit by any manner of means. Something bad must have happened. I could hear the soft, urgent murmur of voices. The tone of the officer's solicitous voice was beleaguered and serious. His face looked exceedingly grave. His disheartened demeanour was very troubled. Something bad had happened, but who to, I wondered. You must have it wrong, my mother insisted. Julia's in her bedroom doing her homework. Sorry, ma'am, but it's definitely your daughter, Julia. She was knocked down by a car this evening. She's in hospital. Mrs. Rolfe ran her over. She knows your daughter very well. She says it was definitely Julia. I'm afraid your daughter was not very responsive. It looks very serious. The injuries are very, very bad. I'm sorry, ma'am, to be the bearer of such bad news. My mother's face grew as white as a sheet, her eyes round with horror. She oscillated her arms above her head and let out a shrill scream. My baby! My baby! Is she going to be all right? Calm down, madam, said the sheriff. Your daughter is in the very good hands at the hospital. They're doing everything they can for her. My baby! My baby! Cried my mother, the tears pouring down her face. I must go to her now. We will take you to the hospital now, ma'am, he said, escorting her out of the house. We were to learn that my sister had sneaked out of the house when she was supposed to be doing her homework to see the neighbours' new puppies, but she'd been knocked over by a car in the road when the driver, Mrs. Rolfe, had been momentarily distracted while she was texting her husband Lucas and failed to see Julia cycling in the road. But the odd thing about the account, that my sister was seen cycling towards her friend's farm when she'd been there only moments before, rather than cycling back towards home. We were to discover that my sister was in a coma, and she'd undergone multiple surgeries. No one was any the wiser whether she would make a full recovery or not, so both my parents were completely devastated. Over the next few weeks, while Julia was in hospital, my parents visited her regularly. I began to feel terribly alone. There was no structure in my life anymore. No relegated homework, no scheduled meal times. Everything in our lives had been turned upside down, topsy-turvy, inside out. My mother would spend countless hours at the hospital visiting Julia, but when she was at home she would pace around our house like a wildcat in a zoo enclosure, with her thoughts focused entirely upon Julia. Sometimes she barely noticed I was even there. She would stand there biting her nails nervously, staring vacantly into space, while my overwrought father wore a wounded, flustered expression on his face that was perpetually grim, as if he was carrying the weight of the world upon his shoulders. Ostensibly, the sorrowful, crushing energy in our home was like a soupy, torrid, humid atmosphere, birthed not by austere, unkind weather conditions outside our home, but the suffocating, muggy energy of our senseless despair and hopelessness that made the climate within our home oppressive, abrasive, and insufferable. We're going to have to pull our weight as a family. We need to be strong for Julia, my father would tell us, but it was easier said than done. People had been so kind. Well-wishers had sent us flowers and brought us home-cooked meals. I had personally visited my sister in hospital on a few occasions, but I didn't recognise her. It would seem her little body was covered in bandages and plasters, while she had tubes coming out of her mouth, heart monitors connected to her, along with all kinds of strange machines and devices. It was hard to even believe that this broken person in the hospital bed was actually Julia. It looked nothing like her. I could see by the morbid expressions on the doctors' faces that things had not improved. My sister's health was rapidly declining. The fear that my sister might never wake up, hung over our head like an ever-present threat. They were the unarticulated words that no one ever dared to broach. No one ever said, "What if?" as the very thought that Julia might not be coming home was too incomprehensible for us to even fathom. I began to feel very isolated, lonely and forsaken in my home, as my parents were never there for me. The compounding grief that my sister was now in a coma had hit my family so hard. It was as if every person in my household had been run over by a forklift truck and had been emotionally decimated, as if every part of us had been squashed into that asphalt road when my sister had that accident. My parents became disconnected, disengaged, and almost divorced from their own lives. They were functioning on autopilot, so that everything was almost done robotically, like the washing, the cleaning, and the shopping. My mother had become such a jittering bag of nerves that she'd been highly sedated by the doctor, who put her on some calming medication that made her become almost zombie-like. I knew I couldn't stand being in the house, so I began to spend a long period of time out in the woods. It offered me the perfect sanctuary and peace that I craved. It was an escapism from the chaotic environment of our broken lives that were as mangled and dishevelled as my sister lying in that hospital bed. My family lived in West Virginia, between the scenic views of the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Ohio River. We lived in a beautiful ranch-style home nestled in a pretty valley. Wherever you looked you would see trees, and yet more trees, the undulating curls of the mountains, and an endless expanse of perfect blue sky, where birds would often soar into the heavens, the most spectacular being the bald eagle. I'd even seen them dropping their young in the sky from time to time, and lifting them up again until the young eagles finally learnt how to fly. It was always breathtaking to watch them. It was on a Saturday morning that I arose early and prepared myself a picnic lunch. I was determined to escape the depressing melancholia that cloaked our home in a heaviness that was so tangible. I decided to take a little backpack with some lunchtime snacks to the woodgrove to spend the afternoon there. I tried to tell my incoherent mother about it, but as usual she seemed preoccupied. "I wonder how Julia's doing," she kept rambling on to herself in unintelligible mumbles as she stared vacantly out of the window, her mind 1,000 miles away. "Mum," I said. "Yes, dear," was her vacant response. "I'm going to the woods. I'm taking my lunch there." "Yes, dear," she said. In truth, I don't think she had even assimilated a single word I'd said. Both my dithery parents were beginning to annoy me. As they were so caught up in limbo, they were not even living their normal lives. My mother formerly had been a slightly overweight woman, with a round, heart-shaped face, who dressed in bright, cheerful colours, was effusive and positive. She was now a zombie. Since Julia's accident, she'd stopped eating, dropped several dress sizes, and become so skinny. She looked like a walking skeleton, her skin ghostly pale, her blue eyes almost faded, her hair tousled and unkempt, while my father had packed on the pounds, as he was always eating to suppress his emotions, or sloshing down copious amounts of beer to drown his sorrows. He would sit in front of the television drinking 6 packs of beer, sometimes getting inebriated. My grandmother had tried to knock some sense into my mother when she had stayed the weekend with us. She had chastised her own daughter. "Claudia, I know Julia's in the hospital, and yes, it is terrible what happened to her. But you need to get a grip, dear. You have a son that is anxious for your love. You are willfully ignoring him. Worse still, you're letting your own health slide. Look at you. You've lost so much weight. The way you're going, you'll make a catwalk model look fat. You need to start eating, dear." Of course, like everything else, my grandmother's warning words were like water off a duck's back, as my mother refused to listen, but continued to be cocooned in her own tortured world, where all her attention was focused on Julia. She hung on to every word the doctors would tell her, as if she was dangling on a cliff face, too terrified to let go in case she fell. I knew if I slipped out of the house, my parents wouldn't even know I was missing. Our home had become like a living morgue. It was as if my parents were living in a parallel universe. I said goodbye to my mother, who was sitting on the green and gold-upholstered couch in our living room, staring at a picture of my sister. "Mum," I repeated, "as I've told you 5,000 times already, I'm going now." "Yes, dear," was her response. I suppose I'd been secretly hoping for some kind of reaction, but none was forthcoming. She didn't seem to care what I was up to or where I was going. which was very upsetting. Never for a moment did she glance up at me. It was like she was a waxwork statue at Madame Tussauds, rigidly fixed on the photograph that she was looking at. But she was almost staring through the photograph, as if her eyes were actually made of glass. I could see my father mowing the turf in the backyard. He was wearing his blue jeans and plaid shirt, but like my mother he was caught up in his own thoughts. I waved at him, but he barely acknowledged me. It left me feeling so unimportant, and as if I wasn't nearly as precious to them as my sister. I was beginning to resent her for consuming so much of my parents' time. I think I was actually jealous of her in some kind of warped way, as she was getting their undivided attention. Gone were the days when my mother asked me if I'd done my homework, or when she told me I had to be in bed by 10 o'clock, or when I was told to eat all my cabbage or I wouldn't get dessert. Now I could leave all my food and just eat dessert, and my parents wouldn't even bat an eyelid. All the boundaries that had been placed around my life, that I'd always despised, had been lifted. My parents didn't care any more about anything now that Julia was in a coma. It was as if the safety and security of our home had come crashing down. I craved those parental boundaries more than ever. I longed for my mother to tell me to eat the food on my plate. I longed for her to relegate me to my bedroom for a couple of hours to complete my homework. Those things would have made me feel loved and noticed, for I began to feel lonely and isolated in my home, with parents who were never present and were as inspiring as the white paint on the exterior walls of our home. I reluctantly climbed on my bike and cycled down the long ribbon of asphalt to the wood grove that was situated on the edge of an old logging road. It wasn't too far from our home. I loved it there. It was early spring, spectacularly beautiful, as the dogwood trees were in blossom, their boughs covered in delicate spring blooms, along with the service berries, eastern budwoods and tulip trees. Soft shafts of twinkling sunlight cascaded through the branches of the trees, dappling the forest floor in a shimmering ethereal light. I placed my bicycle against a red maple tree, venturing into the heart of the woods, where the voluptuous trunks of the trees penciled up into the sky like statuesque verdant giants, their vast boughs creating a fabulous canopy over my head. My cushioned rubber soles pressed the soft earthen floor beneath my feet, where pretty lacy ferns were scattered liberally across the floor, and green moss carpeted fallen tree branches. Yellow daffodils and bluebells gathered together in cheerful little clusters. A little red fox with a full bushy tail stopped for a second to watch me, and then it scampered off, while a couple of squirrels eyed me curiously through inquisitive brown eyes before they scuttled up the branches. I could hear the pretty sounds of the birds, the warbles, tweets and chirrups, as well as the crashing sound of the white water thundering over the rocks in the pretty stream that meandered through the woods. I happened to look up in the branches of a Herculean-sized tree, which had the most superb solid structure, where at one time an old dilapidated treehouse had stood. No one knew who had built the treehouse, as it had been there for a very long time, but over the years it had fallen apart, although the structure and base were still pretty solid. I was surprised to see that someone had put it together again in a haphazard way that wasn't aesthetically pleasing, but somehow it worked. They had weaved branches, grasses and saplings into the structure. It was very crude and rudimentary, but I was curious and assumed some kids had created this little hideout. Naturally, I was intrigued, so I climbed up the tree to examine it closely and to investigate the structure better. I was pleased with what I found. It really was quite cosy up there. It smelt a little musty, but that didn't put me off in any way. The original treehouse floor was still in place, and there was a wide door-like opening that overlooked the stream, and the view over the water was absolutely magnificent. I sat down to enjoy the panoramic view and decided to eat my sandwiches up in this sheltered space. I opened up my plastic container and pulled out a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and took a bite. It tasted delicious, as everything eaten outdoors invariably does. I also took a big swig of orange juice from my thermos flask. It was peaceful up in the treehouse. I could see long ribbons of moving water cascading over the rocks, which was so hypnotic that I found myself shutting my eyes for a moment and beginning to drift off to sleep. How long I was out for I don't know, but I was lying on the treehouse floor in a curled heap. All of a sudden I woke up to hear a creaking sound. Someone was climbing up the tree. I began to panic as a hefty silhouette manoeuvred itself up the tree trunk until it was hovering over me. Then I saw it. Nothing prepared me for what I was witnessing. It was a surprise to see me, as I was to see it. This thing was a monster. There is no other way to describe it. It was quite literally the most terrifying creature I have ever beheld. A creature that belongs to the realms of fairy tales or gruesome legends, but not in our reality. I was so startled by what I was seeing that I rubbed my eyes a couple of times to ensure I wasn't dreaming. But this was no dream. This was my worst nightmare come to fruition. The creature looked human, in its body shape and silhouette, but it possessed the muzzle, tail and claws of a dog, but it stood on 2 feet like a man. I sat up from my sleeping position with eyes as wide as saucers and a mouth hanging open with astonishment. I could feel my entire body trembling. The creature glared at me with treacherous red eyes that depicted such a malevolent hatred towards me. I realized that this little treehouse was its den, and he wasn't happy with me for making myself at home in his nest. I watched in horror as it lifted back its thin black lips to reveal those sharp, ghastly canine teeth, while it let out the most terrifying roar. I began to scream. I literally bolted down the wrong side of the tree to escape its grasp. But this hideous, repugnant thing was after me. I could hear its heavy breathing, grunting, and occasional snarl. I knew I was in trouble. Big, big trouble. My heart was thundering violently in my chest, while my life flashed before my eyes. I was certain I was about to die. I lost my footing, stumbling down the tree. I fell with an almighty thud. I landed on the ground at an unfortunate angle. I could feel my ankle throbbing as waves of pain shot through my foot. I tried to get up, stumbling on all fours, raising myself to my feet. I began to hobble awkwardly. The pain was excruciating. There was no way I could get away from this beast. All of a sudden, large clawed hands grabbed me by the arm, throwing me to the ground with a powerful force. The creature pounced on top of me, crushing my body beneath his weight. I could hear his heart beating against my body, smell his vile, hot breath. It smelt like rotten meat. He blew hot air on my neck. I was terrified. I shut my eyes as tightly as I could. I did try to fight back, wiggling my body beneath his, but he held me down with such a powerful brute force that I couldn't even move a muscle. The next thing I knew was this creature was licking my neck with his huge, hot, wet tongue. It was drooling over me as its spittle began dribbling all over my face. Then something quite extraordinary happened. A thunderous booming sound could be heard bounding through the forest. It sounded like hundreds of bison were running towards us, kicking up the ground with their hooves as the forest seemed to heave and groan. It was unlike any sound I've ever heard before. The sound came to a sudden stop, and then I heard the most frightful roar. The creature that had been crushing me under his weight jumped to his feet. He reacted adversely to that roar. I opened my eyes to see fear in his eyes. He let out a strange, anguished cry. He began to hightail it out of the forest as fast as he could, clearly rattled by what was approaching us. And that was when I saw it. Standing in between 2 red maple trees, looking directly at me, through deep-set dark eyes, was a Bigfoot. I should have been terrified, but the Bigfoot's eyes were so incredibly kind, as it regarded me with such a sincere, genuine look, as though it was worried about my welfare. It seemed protective towards me. At the time I didn't know what it was, but it stood up on 2 legs at about 8 foot tall and 3 foot wide across the shoulder area. It was covered in long flowing golden brown hair, with overlong arms and a pyramid-shaped head, and a face that was so remarkably human. It gestured for me to get up, and escorted me through the forest, walking about 3 feet behind me all the time. I kept hearing it saying in my mind, "I've got your back. You're going to be all right." I was hobbling badly, but gradually my ankle seemed to improve. Luckily it wasn't badly sprained, nor was it broken. I found my bicycle, and the creature continued to follow me until I turned down the driveway that led to my own home, and then he glided away and was gone from my sight. I never saw him again, but I know that Bigfoot saved me from a very dangerous predator that I knew was about to kill me Of that I am in no doubt. To cut a long story short, my sister came out of a coma after 3 months. Her memory came flooding back shortly afterwards. Me and my sister both compared notes and are absolutely convinced that the dog-like creature that chased after her that day was the same one that tried to attack me in the woods when I took refuge in its nest. We never shared our stories with our parents to avoid upsetting them further. It would seem that both of my parents didn't fare well from my sister's drawn-out coma, but finally, after a little counselling, they bounced back. They became the loving parents we once knew. I was so grateful now for the boundaries and rules. It meant my parents were paying attention to me again. My sister made a full recovery from her accident and was given a golden retriever from our neighbour as a gift. We called her Chancer, as my sister said she'd been given a second chance at life. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.